crews that have, as you pointed out, no possibility of getting access to any kind of welfare or being in any way well looked after. And if anything goes wrong, the actual beneficial owners, who will be some layers away, can near enough wash their hands of the vessel and have no kind of personal consequence for it.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Undocked, and hello to you, Nick Chubb.
Hello, Raal Harris. How are you? Happy New Year. This is our first episode of the new year, so I'll say Happy New Year.
I think this is the final thing. There's always a great deal of anxiety around when one should stop saying Happy New Year. You know, the first day back was already sort of 5th of January, wasn't it? So I think next week is moving into the...
Is that your cutoff?
I think it is this year.
I take liberties. I go all the way to the end of January.
Do you?
It's the first time I see someone. Yeah. And then I stop in February.
I don't think there's harm in doing it, but there is a sort of nervousness, and then there's always a risk they'll be irritated. I'm not.
Like when you're checking into a flight and they say, "Have a safe flight," and you go, "You too." I always do that.
Yeah.
And I always feel like such a
They might be going somewhere. You never know. You never know. So yeah, so you can say Happy New Year. And I think if I start talking about my escapades over Christmas and New Year period, I don't think we'll get much time for discussing maritime transformation, which is what we're here to do. So I'll leave that. But yeah, needless to say, it was nothing went as planned.
You got caught in a little half inch of snow, didn't you? And then
indeed. We're not built for it, but it turned out to be a very serious amount of snow. I was up in Yorkshire, for those that are interested in Yorkshire in the northeast. Sort of like 20 years worth of snow came down in. It was a big one. Needless to say, I'm shopping for a new car, but there we go. Let's leave it at that.
This episode of Undocked is brought to you by Acceleron. Running ships is complex enough. Managing emissions compliance shouldn't make it harder. Yet every year, new rules add more admin, more data to collect, more reports to file, and more pressure on your teams. Acceleron's Loreka 360 emissions desk changes that. It's a complete compliance service that handles every step: data checks, documentation, forecasting, and verification, all powered by intelligent software and guided by experts who've actually worked at sea. The result? Accurate reporting, less stress, and more time to focus on what really matters: operating ships. Find out more at acceleron.com/emissions-desk.
Well, so what's new with you, Nick? What? I mean, it's very early in the year. Anything cool?
It is. Well, I mean, first things first. I'm still on something of a high after our interview yesterday, which won't go out probably for a couple of weeks. We interviewed Michael Scove, the CEO of Hafnia, and that was a really fun conversation. I thought it was all going to be very, very serious, but also hugely insightful, kind of getting an understanding of how a large ship owner operator has to think about the market and has to think about how they invest in the future, in future technologies, in how they improve the business, where they allocate capital. I just thought it was really interesting. So I'm going to just start off by saying that if you like the sound of that you need to make sure you're subscribed so that you get notified of when it goes out, which will be, I think, probably in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's not one to miss. It's a very different one from all the others that we've done. Even though you know Michael's CEO, he fits the profile of a lot of the people that we've had, CEOs and people running big shipping operations. I think but it is a really different one, and I think what people, as by way of a teaser, I think it's a much more commercially focused one. We avoid a lot of the repeat themes, and there was quite a lot of new things to think about there. And I think what's really interesting there is sort of the chat about market cycles and all that sort of stuff. So, as Nick said, subscribe, and then you will get all notifications of it. I mean, before Christmas, we closed. Again, another plug. If you didn't listen to our Christmas one, or end of year Christmas kind of show special, we conducted the Shippy Awards. We awarded the great and the good, as far as we saw it, in some key categories. So do check that one out. But we when we did that one, I was looking ahead and thinking, well, we're recording in the first week back. And you know, are we actually going to have anything to talk about? And I very nearly suggested to you, maybe we should wait for
knock it on the head.
Yeah, until someone puts out a press release or kind of some major measure happens. But as luck would have it, the industry has not been idle. So I'll kick us off, if I may, about one of the key themes I think that
Please
we've
do.
seen there. An M&A deal announced in the first week of January, which is, from a
Starting the year
comms.
strong.
I used to do comms, that was my main thing. And I think you're always looking for, timing of these things, when you're going to have maximum impact. And I think this was a slow week for a lot of the news cycle. So congratulations to the comms team at V Group we're talking about today, because V Group have announced their acquisition of Njord. V Group, I don't think anybody listening to this show, unless they're extremely new to shipping, will not know V Group. V Group, one of the biggest third-party ship managers in the world. Very big in terms of number of ships. I think I should have checked, but I think it's always kind of around and maybe even upwards of 600 sort of vessel kind of
Yeah, I was going
mark.
to say somewhere between 500 and 700. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and that's not unusual for it to go up and down for managers. So one of the biggest players, certainly in ship management terms, and they've announced this to the market, this acquisition of Njord. Njord are an interesting company, I think, and they're partly what I want to talk to about today. This kind of what would you call the segment? It's kind of ship efficiency, decarbonisation, something. I think I did kind of come up with a segment title. I'll get to that in a sec. But really, the space they're operating in is using some of these kind of so they're not a maker of the solutions in the way that, say, Bar Technologies with the wind-assisted propulsion, or Silverstream with their technical solution. But they're working sort of with those kind of technologies, looking at those optimizations alongside some other kind of areas as well. And we will talk about the segment a little bit, but it's an interesting acquisition, I think, from the point of view. So this is also, I should say, about Njord. Njord actually span out of Maersk Tankers, so Danish company, and I assume ownership has taken hands within the course of the deal here. And why V Group have done this, let's look at that. Obviously, we're not party to that information, but V Group are one of the ship managers who have probably led the way, it's fair to say, in the services segment. So what's different about that? Technically managing the ships on behalf of your clients, but then also monetizing services. So what are we talking about there? We're talking about things like travel, for example, catering. These are the things that can be plugged in to help you to kind of manage the ship and to deal with some of these aspects. And this is a really interesting move from V Group to actually acquire Njord, because it's then going to strengthen that services arm. And I think today, this is one of the things I'd really like to get into, if we can, around what this service segment looks like and what this is doing to both in and outside of the ship management space.
Yeah, this is quite interesting, isn't it? Because V Group were acquired by Star Capital in 24, I think, back end of 24. It wasn't in our M&A episode, so I assume it must be 24. And whenever there's a change of hands from private equity owners, there's always a view to kind of where do you find the new growth. And through 25, V Group stood up a decarbonisation practice, which I think is quite a consulting-led practice that I think has been quite successful. And this Njord acquisition fits perfectly within that, as far as I see it. I guess just to try and explain what companies like Njord do, if you're going to invest in an energy saving device, one, there's a huge upfront commitment that someone's got to pay, because these are large, often mechanical devices that have to be fitted onto the ship. So that could be something that would, air lubrication, for example, bubbles under the hull that would allow the ship to glide through the water more smoothly. It could be a barrier on the bow that will reduce the wind drag for the vessel. It could be something that would improve the actual carbon emissions from the engine or consumers. So it could be carbon capture systems, all of those sorts of things. Now, all of those systems have their own embedded carbon footprint. And installing them, taking the ship out to a dry dock and all of that has a carbon footprint attached to it. And then you have to, one, make sure that the system is technically going to fit the ship in terms of what the ship, the space the ship has available, the technical requirements of the ship, the budget of the ship owner. But then two, most importantly is actually making sure that the additional emissions that you create in actually putting this stuff on board the vessel has a relatively fast payback in terms of emissions reduction. Because if a ship is coming towards the end of its life, it's only got 5 years left, you might actually increase the overall footprint for the vessel by putting some of this equipment on. Actually making judgments around this is hugely, hugely complex. It depends on where the ship's trading, what sort of cargoes it takes, for the ship type, the ship size. And it's a very, it requires real expertise, not just in the systems, but also in the vessels. And so class have done a fairly good business around this. Most of the class societies have practices in this space, but Njord was one of the first sort of semi-independent companies that scaled to some significant degree. And obviously, as you said, Raal, spun out of Maersk Tankers, which is their second kind of major spin out. And I think it makes perfect sense that they would end up sat underneath V Group, because that feels like the major emerging growth market or growth opportunity for a company like V.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think you're right to sort of see this as a logical progression from some of the moves that V have been doing. Been very active in this space, contributing to things like the Maersk Moller Center. Matt Dunlop, good friend, helped me in the past with advice and so on. And James Halliwell, I should give a shout out to James as well,
Yep.
who's been key there, doing lots of work, not on just on behalf of their clients, but also contributing to the industry, as I mentioned there, the Maersk McKinney Center, but also IMO working groups, all that sort of thing. So they've been really active in that, thought leading in that. So it's natural that this is an evolution of that. And I think it's worth us pausing for a second, because we kind of got into this in the discussion with Michael yesterday, but also when we were wrapping up the year and looking at some of the themes from the year. You might kind of look at it and say, well, decarbonisation has kind of hit the buffers. The net zero framework not passing through IMO, that's really slowed down the kind of the progression of this. With the sort of moves that kind of noises that Trump's been making, hasn't all the kind of wind gone out of this, gone out of the sails of this? And I think that what's nice about this deal is maybe it does make sure that it sends that message in the other direction, because I think, as we talked about on other shows, yes, the new fuels aspect of things, I think undeniably the uncertainty will prevent perhaps the push that we might have seen into some of those kind of areas. But in terms of the determination and the wins to be had from the fuel efficiency, energy saving measures, that is very much alive. And I think that listening to, for example, a forum of Greek ship owners talking in the run-up to the net zero framework, whilst there was some concerns raised about that, they were all full-throated about the need for more energy efficient shipping. And I think we have to, just forget all the niceties of it, and it is the right thing to do. This has got hard material facts in terms of the costs involved. And that's sort of, the obvious one there is fuel cost. It's one of the biggest operational spend, if not the biggest operational OPEX spend of any vessel. But also we do, as we talked about in the awards show, we awarded the EU, I think, Maritime Transformation for being the biggest kind of, game changer of the year. This is the material change. We've gone from a situation where this was something that would appear in, you can do this and it can go in your ESG report and it might kind of influence a few things, it might unlock a little bit of finance or something like that, to being like, this is going to directly impact your commercial operations, because you're having to pay. We're now in the under Fuel EU, under these measures, and ETS as well. There is a material cost to this, and that's where this services really comes in, because like all the best offers you can possibly be involved in the business of selling, if you can actually be selling that you're going to be saving money and this is going to pay for itself, that's a great place to find yourself.
It's interesting, because I've always found that ship managers, third-party managers, are kind of stuck in a bit of, like, between a rock and a hard place when it comes to any kind of decarbonisation initiative. For anyone who isn't familiar with the role third-party managers play, so the ship owner will own the asset, will own the vessel. the charterer will hire the asset to move some cargo around, and the third-party manager, which is a service provider like V Group, provides the technical management of the ship. So they might provide the crew. They will hold the legal document of compliance that basically allows the ship to run. And they are a service provider that charges a daily fee to the ship owner to run the vessel on their behalf, and their margin is the difference between the fee they're paying to the ship, the fee the ship owner is paying, and the cost to them in terms of crewing the vessel and running all the technical procurement, all of that sort of stuff. So they don't actually have any control over capital investments into the ship at all. They have to work kind of hand in glove with the ship owner to get that stuff to happen. And they don't really have that much control in terms of bringing in things like software, for example, for voyage performance or vessel routing, all of that sort of stuff, because ultimately the other party, the charterer, is the one who ends up paying the fuel bill. So you end up in this really strange mix where you've got the manager is kind of stuck between the owner and the charterer. Everyone is asking for efficiency improvements, but actually their room to maneuver within that space is very, very limited because they can only really impact the kind of day-to-day running of the ship. So that's why I think, going into this services world is quite interesting. One, in general, anything they can do to improve the way the ship runs and sell that to a ship owner is a good thing. But services specifically to support the ship owners to decarbonize, I think, are really, really interesting.
Yeah.
It allows them to have some kind of lateral movement in that space.
I think that's a really good take. And I think the thing that you mentioned there is one of those tensions that exists in the industry as we look to evolve, that very often we might find ourselves in competing interests, really, because of the contractual terms and the nature of the engagement with different stakeholders. Whereas if you contrast that with Odfjell, when we had Odfjell on, they are owner operator. They're able to look much more holistically at how they kind of deliver those savings and don't have that same barrier. But what I would say is that in the way in which things are evolving and the industry is evolving, whilst the ship manager doesn't have a say in those things that you mentioned there, what they're doing in their operations will have direct impact in a way that affects it. So whether there's a sort of a contractual nature to it, or indeed whether there's just a symbiotic relationship to it, I think it's something that needs to evolve and needs to be worked out, and that's where I think ship managers are seeing that they're able to play a bigger role in their customers' success through these kind of additional add-on services. And I should say as well, in case anyone's unaware, I'm the vice president at the moment of Intermanager, which is the trade association for ship managers. So this is a subject that's very, very sort of close to my heart. And when we think about like why ship managers are moving into this space, let's say, I think it's interesting and worthy of discussion as well. So yeah, V Group we mentioned have acquired Njord. Let's look at what else is happening within the ship management space, and you'll see that there are similar, comparable kind of services being offered across those. And again, in disclosure, I'm working for OSM Tome at the moment. They've set up Ivigo, which is their sort of dedicated sort of sustainability green solutions kind of unit, doing very very similar things. As you say, it's a mixture of kind of advisory and being able to sort of put together that sort of strategic plan alongside customer as a partner to be able to kind of leverage those assets. Anglo Eastern should mention as well. Again, these are all the big boys we're mentioning here. Anglo Eastern have something called SAPS, which is Sustainability and Performance Services. We had Bjorn Højgaard on the show. Have a listen to that if you haven't heard that episode. That's a great one. And looking at that, so they've got, again, a very similar focus. Now, why service and why is the model sort of like, because advisory is quite transactional or potentially quite transactional. It's like bring in advise on a project for us, and then that sort of seems quite finite. I think the thing about this is that there's different elements to the services that these ship managers are providing in terms of like being able to assist you with all of your reporting, helping you to understand that. And why is that really, really important? I should mention some of the others before I get into that, right? So we've got Bernard Schulte as well. He's the president of Intermanager. So they have their performance center led for decarbonisation, again, doing very similar things. And I should mention that although others may not have these kind of explicit branded services, you will see similar kind of elements of this in Columbia, in Williamson, Synergy, all of those, Wallam, those players as well. So just to come back to really why ship managers are interested in this space. Now, as you said, one of the key things that's driving ship managers to look at this is the way in which this is directly impacting their customers' operations. So they can see that and they can see where they can potentially add value. Also, it's, as you mentioned, Nick, that the margins in ship management are very, very tight. So if everyone's doing the same thing, it's very easy for a ship manager to kind of go around, try and cut better deals. You end up with this sort of race to the bottom. So innovation is really the name of the game, and diversification and being able to kind of solve more and more of your customers' problems. And this is undoubtedly an area where smaller operators are really going to struggle. Because when you look at the complexity, particularly if they're sort of trading in Europe or in other parts of the world, are starting to set up their own sort of ETS kind of style things, their own kind of fuel EU legislation. So this is not only Europe we're talking about. The complexity of this in terms of the reporting, in terms of the modeling that you need to do, in terms of being able to forecast the credits that you need to buy, carbon credits and all of that sort of thing, is making it more and more attractive, I would say, to get together with a ship manager to kind of solve some of these problems with you, who can operate at scale. Now, why scale is particularly important is when you look at the real foundational aspects of this, having access to data is the real differentiator. Because if you're able to see what works for a range of vessel types, doing different trades, you're able to directly pull in from experiential data, and whether that's hard data from sensors and all that sort of stuff, or whether that's anecdotally and pick up on some of those points. Number one, just having access to all of that makes you much more informed to be able to do it. The second thing is to say is that it allows somebody to be the broker and the aggregator. Because exactly as you said, Nick, if we look at all of the different levers that are being pulled to achieve the kind of fuel efficiencies that we're talking about here, it's a myriad number of things. If you look at the case of the Bow Olympus, which is the one we often go on about because, let's face it, it worked. It was a combination of a number of factors: the sales, suction sales, modifications, I believe, to other aspects of the hardware of the ship as well, but using technology for weather routing, changing some things operationally about how the crew kind of, work with things. There was a lot of different aspects. And obviously that means potentially that there's multiple vendors with various, promises from the solutions that they have. So having somebody who can be in that position to be an honest broker in that, to look at those different solutions and to be able to talk about how they kind of work in combination and stuff like that, it does put ship managers in a really sweet spot, I think.
Yeah, I think there's very, very few organizations in the world that have the combination of volume of data and depth of expertise as you would find in a large ship manager to be able to make a judgment call on this stuff. And I guess as long as they stay relatively technologically agnostic in terms of who they're working with and the options that they present to the ship owners, then I can see there's probably very few people who are sort of better placed to make those kind of calls, or at least to support the owner to make those calls.
It's not only that, Nick, it's also thinking about more holistically how that whole process is going to work. A lot of ship managers, for example, will be able to take care of ship repairs and even new builds and things like that. So they have great relationships with a lot of the shipyards and that kind of thing. So they're also able to add value there. When you look at something like a lot of these technological solutions that are coming in, some of them have a real-time impact on the crew in terms of how things that the crew might need to do, things that might change from a navigational perspective, things that might change from a cargo operations perspective. Things may be affected by these different solutions. And again, who's doing that? The ship manager is doing that in terms of the crewing function and then the training function, which is enabling the crewing. So you do start to see that there's a really natural fit in this combination of services to be able to get the wins that are there to save their customers money.
Have you heard of a company called Signal, by the way? Signol?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I can't say I know them very well, but yeah, go on.
They're a really interesting software company. I think actually Bernard Scholter invested in them as well. So they're kind of,
possibly,
from that kind of that kind of world, or at least they have relationships in that kind of world. They started in the aviation sector, and the whole concept behind it is just simple nudge theory. As in, people generally speaking want to do the right thing. People generally speaking want to reduce emissions, but you're in the middle of a complex operation if you're on board the ship, and it's difficult to remember to do these things. And so they started with Virgin Atlantic, and all they would do simply when they first started was just put a little ping up in the cockpit to remind the captain when they were getting going that when you're taxiing, you only need to use one engine. And you can turn on the other engine when you're ready to take off. And that alone saved hundreds of thousands of tons of aviation fuel, one tiny change. So then they took that and they looked across the entire kind of process of taking a plane from one gate through a flight to the next gate, and looked at all of the opportunities where actually you could very safely save some fuel just by reminding the pilots to do particular things, speed of acceleration and that sort of stuff. And it ended up being the cheapest carbon abatement program that Virgin Atlantic had ever run in terms of cost per tons of CO2 saved. And so they took that concept and they took it into the maritime sector, and they took it in via Bernard Scholter as one of the investors in it. And they do exactly the same thing for either for the captain or for the chief engineer, or for the deck officer or engineer who's on watch. Really simple things like, do you need to have 2 generators running right now? Can you go on just one? When you're going to go off for smoko, when your 10 o'clock break for a coffee, are you going to shut down this equipment, or are you going to leave it running? Little things that you can nudge the captain to do, nudge the deck officers to do, nudge the engineers to do, actually make real impact on how the vessel runs. So they've been able to report 675 tons of fuel savings, 38,900 kilos of CO2 savings, and on the maritime fleets that they've run, purely by just nudging the decision makers on board in terms of how they use the equipment. So again, it comes back to what is within the abilities of a technical manager, because there's no extra equipment that has to go on the ship. It's just about helping the people on board run it better, basically.
That's really interesting, because when you and I were working on that first human capital management report that we did, this was one of the areas that was kind of like, I don't think we managed to get enough, anything sort of tough enough to put in there to back it up. But I think whilst doing the research around that and talking to lots of people, there are amazing number of things on the fuel efficiency front that, because of the scale, and the one that always stuck in my mind was the shutting the blinds on a cruise ship. So when the customers are all out for the day, the passengers, are out for the day, the guests, they're all out. If the windows are open and the sun's glaring in, on the scale of some of these cruise vessels, the aircon's kicked in to try and cool the room down. So if you encourage when they come in to turn the beds, close the blinds, keeps it cooler. And I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head. It caught me off guard. There was also, that's a really good example of where you might think these things are fairly trivial, but they make a massive amount.
They really add up. Yeah.
And because everything comes at an energy cost. Whether it's just even water, in terms of making potable drinking water and stuff like that. So if you're brushing your teeth with the tap running, it's making a massive difference when you're on board a ship. I also remember a very interesting case study that a chap who actually works for Clear now, but I think he was talking about a case study that he did for Stolt, where he was talking about trying to change the behavior of engineers to switch certain pumps off and to have the confidence to switch them off when they were in port and they weren't being needed, instead of kind of having them running. But that was a kind of a part of that, if I remember correctly on the case study, was encouraging them to have the confidence that they would start back up again if you switched them off. So it was there were good reasons why people perhaps weren't doing things. So I think that's a really interesting part of it. The other thing to say is just to come back to this sort of this as a service, let's say, and some interesting things. So Pia Melling, a colleague who was, still is running Avigo. She's just been promoted, just announced today, another undocked scoop. We have great timing, Nick. It's always something to talk about. She's just been appointed the Chief Services Officer. So Tommy Oliverson was doing that. He's moved up. Pia's now moving in to run all the services across OSM. She's agreed to come on the show as well, which is fantastic. But I had a really good chat with her when I saw this story, and we just kind of had a bit of a chat about it. Now, to come back to your point there, because you made a good one there, the ship manager doesn't always get to choose the software that's being run. If the ship changes charterer, the new charterer may insist on additional reporting and stuff that the crew need to do. So that human element with the crew and the changes that they can make, the kind of changes you were just talking about that are material, but they're also a fundamental part of the success of all these solutions because they're the ones who are having to often populate the system with the kind of information that it needs and to be doing that. So we've talked about in the past, I think we did a pretty much whole episode on this sort of technology overload and the risks that are associated with that. So part of what they're doing within that service arm, she said, is a very, very important part of the service that they offer. There was about kind of almost like a digital transformation piece to that as well, in terms of looking at the technology, how that works together, making sure that the data is right and ready for the reporting needs and all of that sort of stuff. So that's a big part of it as well. So being able to kind of see through those kind of, change management process of what's actually got to happen from the people dimension to be able to deliver the success as well. So I thought that was quite an interesting one. And then the other discussion that I had in the course of this week, bizarrely, was with Martin Bennell. You know Martin, don't you? From
the name rings a bell.
Ex of Farstream. He's sort of in the
recruitment. Yeah. Of course,
Martin's been helping out
a
company called Holder, who are in this space as well. We had a little bit of a chat. He's been doing some work with them, and again, one of the things that I found really interesting about that is that sort of naval architect expertise to be able to look at what this is actually in the specifics of the vessel, what this is going to do, because all of these solutions will have a kind of a promise, right? But actually looking at the specific case of your vessel and what that's going to take to deliver it is a key part to it. So one of the things he was talking about to me, which I found really interesting, was it was like, well, you're interested in doing this. What about employing things like digital twins to be able to, and mathematical models to be able to kind of simulate what will be the real return? And why that's really important in this world is exactly what you were saying around the return of investment. If you can start to see what are the likely material gains from it, and being able to put that together with your own obviously assessment of the situation, be able to sort of play out what expectations you can have, and then see if those can be delivered. And that seemed to me to be like another interesting aspect to it. We've talked in the past around how the way in which technology is evolving and some of these services are perhaps breaking down some of the traditional competitors and spaces. And you said it yourself, clearly this is the sort of thing that class would typically be doing.
Yeah.
So this is, again, I think a really interesting kind of evolution.
Well, all of the class societies, I guess, have kind of gone in the direction of buying software companies, right? All the major ones, at least, all software-enabled services companies. And I think if you look at technical management as a topic, you could go to any of the major class societies and get a full fleet ERP, maybe with one or two exceptions. And you're absolutely right. It does create. It creates a conflict for the class to provide advice on software, certainly, which has actually ended up being a space that Thetis occupies, partly for that reason. And I could see an issue down the line of if you end up as a ship manager backing individual technology suppliers in this space, that you end up in a very similar position where you kind of create this kind of natural conflict. But that said, I think the technology that is being developed for this stuff, I think this is going to be an enormous market. Even even with decarbonisation, quote unquote, hitting the buffers, as you said, I see that as a short-term outcome of geopolitics rather than anything else. I think this market is going to be enormous by 2040.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we'll look back on the last, say, 12 months as being a bit of a blip. And I think I think I'm not talking out of school. Let me make sure that this is framing this as my own opinions. I think if we talked about net zero framework a lot in the end of the year, the Christmas special.
Yeah, we did.
And I think we were both a little bit down about it. I think what's starting to emerge now is a discussion around what really went wrong. Now, I think if you look at the headlines, or you were to look at the kind of the overall thing, I think undeniably you would say that there was some very determined national interests kind of pushing. So the US being the obvious one, they were I don't think it's contentious to say that they were actively attempting to undermine it. Others were suggested within that as well. But what I think is starting to emerge now as some of the fallout of that is being sort of scrutinized in a little bit more detail. And I think what you start to see is that some of the things that prevented people getting behind it were surmountable problems. They were things that could have been dealt with. One of those being the EU did not agree or make explicit that if the IMO measures went ahead, they would withdraw their own. And that was, it turns out, quite a big deal for people because they were looking at the possibility of having to be paying twice effectively to it. Now that was surmountable. That was dealable with. That's a potentially a communications problem or a negotiating issue or something like that. But you can see that as being a surmountable problem. The second one, a lot of people have invested very heavily in ESG as a pathway, as the least worst available, thing. It made a lot of sense as a transition. There wasn't sufficient kind of protection and backing, it seems, along there as well. So I think it's easy to kind of go, well, that's the reason that's kind of given everyone license to not bother anymore. But I think there are other things in there, and possibly those can encourage us to be things that can be worked on and can be surmountable and enable us to kind of get somewhere. But that's number one. The second thing is that you can say what you like, but you cannot change the inescapable fact that climate change is real. There are consequences to it, and the date is not going to move, and governments will be preparing along those lines. And so this makes complete and total sense to get behind, not least because it has massive cost saving potential as well.
Yeah. The commercial benefits are can be huge.
Absolutely.
On the topic of geopolitics, I saw quite an interesting story on the Dark Fleet and sanctions, if you fancy that.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up because that was that was another thing that was on my list because it's pretty scary. And it came up. It came up.
You show me yours and then I'll show you mine. What have you got?
Just thematically. I mean, obviously the big headline stuff is the seizure of these Venezuelan tankers, right? And one of which in our own UK waters, I think, or close by. Some interesting characteristics. Changing name and flag mid-voyage was being one of them. But I think that is an illustration of a problem that's been on the radar for a while. We're all sharing the same waters. International standards are there, and the idea that the things like sanctions have broken that. And in allowing, and I'm not saying that the sanctions are responsible for it, but it's created a climate in which people have looked to be outside, and then deciding that being outside also means that you don't need to do even some of the most fundamental things. So, crew welfare, forget about it. Seaworthiness of vessel, forget about it. Insurance, fundamental things that we would imagine. Perhaps you've got it in there in front of you, but the number of vessels that are going up with this at this rate is one thing to be frightened of. The other thing that, just to say to it, and I saw a post around this earlier, I'm afraid I can't remember who it was, but someone was pointing out within shipping, it's a very, very complex supply chain. When sanctions came in, actually, is a really good indication of sometimes the journey that you have to go through. Keep your own nose clean of working out what are all the relationships and does this anywhere end up sitting with this dark fleet, in play as a broker, as someone kind of, trying to negotiate that. It's very, very difficult, I would imagine, to avoid some sort of exposure or becoming increasingly difficult. So it's something to be really worried about.
To give a bit of an explainer, because I'm conscious that some people listening may not even really be aware of what the dark fleet is. Starting, I guess, with the point around sanctions. So in the US, there's a body called OFAC, and there are various other bodies. There's a body for the EU, there's a body for the UK, that essentially looks at various people, organizations, countries around the world and says, we as a country do not want to do business with these individuals, with these countries, with these organizations, and particularly with organizations owned by particular individuals. So, for example, the very obvious example is Vladimir Putin has been sanctioned, along with most senior Russians from the Russian government have been sanctioned by governments across Europe, by the UK, by the US. And so in theory, any assets they own that are in those countries where the sanctions are being carried out, for example, any property that's owned in the UK, any money that's sat in bank accounts in the UK or the US, and, of course, ships that could be owned by those individuals, in theory, get frozen. So they can't be used to benefit the individual. Now, with property, or possibly even with companies, that's a relatively straightforward thing to do because, a flat in Belgravia doesn't move. It stays in Belgravia and you can seize it, you can deny someone access to it, and the government can kind of do what they want with it. For a ship, well, a ship's a moving target, first of all, literally a moving target. They physically move around all the time. But then it's very, very easy for me as an individual, and not that I own ships, wouldn't that be nice? But as an individual, if I owned a ship, first off, I wouldn't own the ship directly. I would own a company that would own that ship. And I might own a company that owns 12 companies, that each company owns its own ship. And so that kind of limits my liability, but also puts some distance between me as an individual with the ship. I can also change the flag registry for the ship. So, I could flag with a very reputable country. I could flag my ships in the UK or France or the US, and there are various rules and regulations that go with that. Or I can choose to switch my flag to a less reputable country with possibly more loose regulations. I can also do things like switch off the AIS, which makes the ship genuinely very difficult to track. And so there's a whole range of different methods that you can use. And you used a great example where, there was a story recently of a ship's name and flag was literally changed in the middle of a voyage. It used to be that you could just do this whenever you liked. And then the IMO number was invented. And the IMO number is kind of stamped when you first create a ship or first build a ship. It's sort of stamped on the vessel, and whatever you do to change the name of the ship, to change the owner of the ship, to change the flag of the ship, the IMO number remains constant. So in theory, there is a full record of the ship's life, but the reality is a lot more complex. It's very, very easy to change ownership of these assets, to put it under so many different layers and so many different offshore businesses that it's very, very difficult to work out who actually owns the vessel. So if you are a ship manager, or if you just run a small stores supplying business, ship chandlery business in a port somewhere, and a ship comes in and they want to buy some rope from you, in theory, you've got to sit down and work out who is the individual that is the kind of beneficial owner of that vessel. And that's a really hard thing to do because it can change all the time, and because of all the methods you can use to obfuscate it. And then you throw in the likes of these oil tankers, going around places like Syria and Venezuela that never actually officially dock anywhere. They will go somewhere off the coast. Their AIS will get switched off, and there'll be some kind of ship-to-ship transfer that happens. And then when they're coming to the other side, which it could be any number of places else in the world that may or may not be happy to trade oil with Venezuela, you can do another ship-to-ship transfer. And so the ship that actually ends up landing in that country would be a perfectly legitimate ship, in theory carrying a perfectly legitimate cargo, when the reality actually can be something much more sinister. And this, up until 5 years ago, was a relatively minor issue, I would say, but particularly since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, this has become a really quite serious issue, in that the fleet the dark fleet, as it's called, has grown significantly. And we're now in a position where, as Michael told us yesterday, you've got ships that are going around without any insurance whatsoever, no enforceable regulation for those ships, crews that have, as you pointed out, no possibility of getting access to any kind of welfare or being in any way well looked after. And if anything goes wrong, the actual beneficial owners, who will be some layers away, can near enough wash their hands of the vessel and have no kind of personal consequence for it. So it's a rapidly growing problem, and it doesn't seem to be showing any signs of slowing down. But I did spot this morning quite an interesting announcement from Polestar Global. They've just launched a Maritime Transparency Index. And what they do is they've got 15 years of vessel registration data, vessel tracking data, flag data, ownership data, and they've turned the whole thing into a single index score of how transparent is this vessel in terms of how it's been operated, who's owned it. And I thought it was just quite a clever way of, one of the most difficult things with all of this is that you have to make all of these checks while under intense commercial pressure, because you're trying to fix a ship and actually get the cargo fixed so that the ship can make money. So sometimes you have to make these decisions instantaneously. And what they've done is, by boiling down all of this very, very complex data into a single score, it enables anyone who's looking at chartering a vessel in, or possibly being a counterparty to a ship in some way, to just have a very quick check of how transparent is it. And if it's not transparent, then you can kind of dig into the data of why not, and make your own judgment call.
Interesting. My big question there is how do they define transparency? What's the criteria?
Very good question. So according to Polestar, the scoring model pulls together vessel history such as age, flag changes, ownership transitions, port state detentions and deficiencies. And then it layers on top of that behavior at sea, reporting gaps, spoofing activity, and extended dark periods. And then normal voyage patterns, so port calls, time and port, any ship-to-ship transfers, and unexplained delays. And it kind of brings all of that together with a layer of machine learning that kind of helps turn it into a score. So it ends up, the ship has something akin to a sort of what you would have as a kind of financial credit score that you might have as an individual.
Yeah. Does that mean they're kind of entering the kind of Zenita sort of space, or even maybe even the right ship kind of? Is there?
I think I would say that they are very much. I mean, there's always been vessel tracking for sanctions compliance has always been their bag in some way, and I would say actually vessel tracking for sanctions has probably been more Polestar's bag for the last 10 years than right ships. But yeah, I would say they are coming increasingly together in terms of how competitive they are.
I mean, again, the same point was making really just about these kind of services, the way that kind of, as more data gets aggregated, the lines start to blur between, and you end up with people you would never have envisaged as a competitor suddenly sort of putting their tent on your lawn, as it were.
Yeah, very true.
Interesting.
But it's a growing problem, and I always like cool tech solutions to problems. So I just thought I'd flag it as it's quite a nice way of handling it, I think.
Yeah.
Some good news on that front. The global order is not breaking down everywhere. There is an area where it is potentially coming together, which I think will quite excite you. And I don't know whether you've seen this. Everyone is talking about what the IMO did this last year in 2025 on decarbonisation, but I don't know whether you saw that the FAL committee, the facilitation committee of the IMO, which is the committee responsible for harmonisation of digitalisation and digital communication between ship and shore, have launched a report on the development of their comprehensive strategy for maritime digitalisation. Did you see this?
No, I didn't.
See, it came out very, very quietly. Yeah, well, it came out just before Christmas, and I think basically
that was their present.
No one's paid any attention to it. Partly because of Christmas, I think, and partly because everyone is just so focused on the MEPC stuff.
Yeah.
So this is you ready for the most IMO sentence you'll ever hear? The Facilitation Committee has agreed to establish a correspondence group on the development of guidelines on the development of a comprehensive strategy for maritime digitalisation. So this is the group creating the guidelines for the group that's going to create the strategy. So we're still some way off the strategy. It's going to take a little bit of time, but we are in the process now, or the IMO is in the process of creating guidelines for a comprehensive digitalisation strategy.
Okay, I'm not sure how to take that.
What
I'm
it will become,
to get excited,
and it will take some time, right? This will take
really?
probably 5. This will probably take 5-10 years to come to fruition in a serious way.
Well, this is the danger, isn't it? Because things just are moving so fast. I really appreciate the attempt and the spirit of these things, but I'm highly skeptical that this will, be able to keep pace with what's going on. I mean, the changes are profound, right?
In 5 years' time, the IMO will just be run by a giant AI, so it's all moot anyway. But in the meantime, they're developing a comprehensive strategy that will pull together all of the different digital initiatives that the IMO has had over the last sort of few decades. So maritime single window stuff, maritime autonomous surface ships, all of the reporting stuff, e-navigation and the next generation of hydrographic standards, all of this sort of stuff is going to be pulled into a single giant strategy. And the focus is on creating the kind of high-level functional requirements for data, interoperability, governance, and resilience. And it is going to be goal-orientated. They're going to leave all the how to the various standards bodies that sit underneath. But I quite like it.
Well, I think what it does is it actually gets hold of a problem that we probably talked about pretty much every week for the last 6 months, which is that sort of that data interoperability and I don't want to say enforced cooperation. It's more kind of like, having a way of facilitating the kind of cooperation at data level that needs to be there. Because it's not something that's going to happen through a bunch of kind of well-meaning vendors or one or two ship operators, managers that kind of see the light and there has to be a strategic way of doing it, and it has to be in concert as well. That's the other thing, particularly when we look at the people on board. We can't have all these different circulars, all these different bits of legislation, it's just too difficult when increasingly all of those things need to work together to be, to deliver any kind of value. And I think that is something that increasingly, I don't think there's, it used to be the kind of major gripe of the ship owners. It's moved into being a major gripe amongst vendors, particularly the vendors who are trying to break in. It's worth saying the incumbents are often slightly less willing to sort of talk about it, but now it's starting to go beyond that, and it's starting to be a bugbear for all sorts of other people, including regulators. So so exciting stuff.
Should I talk you through some of the kind of core things that are coming through in there? It's quite a big document. They're going for interoperability first, which is exactly as you were talking about. So all systems must all talk to each other. User-centric design, which I imagine that will excite you because you're a big fan of that.
Very much.
Reducing the administrative burden and reducing reporting requirements, which I think will be a big tick for everyone across the industry.
Massive.
Data harmonization and shared standards. Cybersecurity and sort of secure by design as a foundation. And then inclusivity, making sure that smaller states and small ship owners and operators aren't left behind by the changes that come from it. And it is much bigger than just the ships as well. So one thing I'm slightly unsure of is because the IMO only has purview over ships, but what they're trying to do is bring the whole wider maritime supply chain into this strategy. So all ship-to-shore communications, all the single window stuff going up to governments, digital identities and signatures, which I think is really interesting because I was at a crewing conference at the back end of last year, and a ship owner was telling me how every time they sign on a new crew member, they still have to physically sign a piece of paper for their contract. So possibly by 2030, we'll be in a position where you can digitally sign your employment contract.
Now I'm excited, Nick. now that you've
Good.
given it to, because those are the fundamental, it's good to see that they're looking at that. Now, I think what's really interesting there is what you said about the overall supply chain, because I think that if that doesn't get in there and that doesn't end up being at least a voice at the table, an accountable voice, let's say, at the table for that, I think we'll just end up having another problem, because that's partly, it's that sort of all those different stakeholders beyond the vessel and the main office, all the kind of charter stuff, all these different people who want constant information, reports, updates. If all of that's not considered as one, then we're going to really miss an opportunity, I think, there.
You'll be pleased to know this strategy is being socialized among various other subcommittees over the course of the next year. But the plan is that by the time the General Assembly rolls around in 2027, the strategy on maritime digitalisation will be adopted. So that is actually breakneck speed for the IMO. That's 2 years.
Quick. Yeah.
So quite possibly by the early 2030s, you might see a practical difference in the ships.
Yeah.
But that is fast for the IMO.
Yeah. Are you taking it all right that you didn't get invited to participate?
No comment. Deeply personally offended.
Still time. They'll see the light.
Enough to be invited into the hallowed hall of the IMO, but you're a regular visitor, aren't you?
I am, thankfully. Yeah, look, I think I'm sort of part joking, because I think that we talked about a little bit, just kind of like it's worth dwelling on, when we talked about like the transformation, the Shippy Award that we gave out at the end of the year. We talked about transformation and people who are leading organizations into different areas. And I think that's something that I think the IMO is changing and evolving too under Arsenio. I think he is seeing a need to kind of do things differently. And his, just his personality alone is, without any prescription, it's naturally making the IMO a more accessible place to engage with. Now, the thing about the IMO is that for good reasons, it's very, very sensitive to commercial interests, or for any sort of pressure by commercial interests, or to even approach people. But clearly there are, when it comes to a project like this, there are going to be massive, massive advantages to collaborating with everybody in that supply chain. So one of the ways in which they can do that is through trade associations and that kind of thing, who have a voice, NGO status at IMO, which is helpful. They get to be in the working groups. But I think it's really, really important that, talking to all the vendors out there, I mentioned I'm vice president of ship intermanager. There is an associate route towards the membership there. It's not an expensive thing to do. I think the thing is about engaging with those groups. You can also be an associate member of Intertanko, for example. And I'm not saying that that's going to give you leverage but it will give you, if you look at those channels, it will allow you to be able to contribute sometimes through by proxies into those kind of debates. But I think as well, the IMO needs to change from the perspective of thinking about how it can engage with commercial interests. And they did something very interesting some years back, looking at, again, the theme of the show today, energy efficiency and those kind of measures. And it was a contract that we won as Videotel to produce some e-learning for the IMO that was done. And that was for all the, there were seafarers and there was some for shoreside as well, to teach people about why it was an important subject and why, and it was a very big success. Lots of people went through it and stuff like that. But the way they were actually able to facilitate that was through a very unique setup that they put together as a vehicle to be able to get some commercial partners in. I hasten to add, nobody made any money. It was about being able to consult with those kind of people. I think they may have been able to contribute some funds to the project. I can't remember the exact details, but however it's done, must maintain, of course, the credibility IMO. It can't be subject to commercial interest. That's not proper. But I think we have to, in this particular work stream, it's going to be really, really important that they engage with that the sort of people we've had on the show, the technology entrepreneurs and all of those sorts of people.
Yeah.
Either through channels like I mentioned, or setting up channels where they can, because they need that expertise. They need to understand that the realities of the technologies and implementing them successfully.
I don't think it's not a maritime issue, but any regulation in any sector that's created in a vacuum tends to hit the buffers or cause all sorts of unintended consequences when they go live. So I definitely would back that call to engage very, very closely with industry on this stuff. However, it's exciting to see digitalisation on the agenda and on the agenda at some pace, which is nice.
Good stuff.
Should we wrap it there?
Let's call it
nothing else.
No, that's enough for 1 year.
I was wearing a hat before we came on, and I've got this tuft of hair that I've been staring at for the last hour that we've been recording, that I'm going to go and stick down before my next meeting. I've not been paying attention to you at all. I've just been staring at the tuft of hair.
Well, in that green, you look like you've got a sort of a look of Vladimir Zelensky.
I guess I do. It's not intentional.
Well,
I'll take it. He's a good-looking guy.
Yeah, well, there you go. You're starting off the good year, the new year in the fighting spirit. So thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you again soon.
See you soon. Bye.